The shift had started like any other. The bus wheezed along its evening route, barely populated, with only a handful of regulars I'd come to recognize over the years. But tonight, as I pulled up to the empty stop near 23rd and Willow, something shifted. It was as if the very air around the bus grew heavy. I didn't notice him at first, not until he was already stepping on board, slipping silently into the middle row. No greetings, no evening, driver, just the soft thud of his shoes and a subtle shuffle as he seated himself halfway down the aisle. His clothes were old-fashioned, a dark, woolen coat with sharp lapels and thin, worn fabric. And his skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They were fixed, intently, unblinking, on the rearview mirror. At first, I assumed he was looking at something beyond me, maybe out the back window, but each time I glanced back, he was staring directly into my eyes, as though waiting for some signal. I quickly looked away. It was probably just one of those strange moments when you accidentally meet someone's eyes and neither of you knows where to look. I tried to focus on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I adjusted the mirror slightly so that I wouldn't accidentally catch his gaze again. But a few stops later, there he was, still watching. His gaze was relentless, undeterred by the other few passengers boarding. Even as a family of 4 filed on and filled the seats near him, he didn't flinch or divert his gaze. I glanced back, hoping he'd at least shift a little, blink maybe, or pretend to look at something else. Instead, his stare remained unchanged, unblinking. I turned back to the road, feeling a tightness in my chest. Maybe he was just strange. Plenty of odd folks boarded the bus. But this man was different. I kept my eyes on the road, counting down the stops until he'd be gone. But every time I dared to check, he was still there, watching. His skin was so pallid it looked like paper, almost translucent under the bus's dim lights. A thin, barely visible scar ran from the edge of his left cheekbone down to his jaw, a perfect line, as though etched by a careful, calculating hand. The bus rattled on, and the minutes passed, stretching painfully. With every glance back, I hoped to see him looking somewhere else. But he didn't move, not even a twitch. I adjusted the mirror a few times, hoping to angle it just enough that he'd slip out of view. But no matter how I positioned it, there he was, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath. This was ridiculous. He was just a strange passenger. Maybe he had an eye condition, something that made him unable to break eye contact. Or maybe he just didn't realize he was staring at me. That had to be it. But every time I looked back, I saw those same unwavering eyes, pools of darkness that seemed to drink in the light. His clothes, now that I studied them, looked worn, like they belonged to another era. His coat, his trousers, even his shoes had an antiquated quality, the fabric rough and threadbare, as though he'd stepped straight out of a photograph from 50 years ago. As we passed the 5th stop, I felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of my neck. I told myself to breathe, to focus on the road. But the feeling of his gaze bore into me, insistent and unrelenting, as though he were studying me, dissecting every movement I made. I checked the mirror again, unable to resist. But this time, my heart froze. He was gone. The seat where he had been sitting was empty. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief, but it was immediately replaced by cold dread. He couldn't have left. We hadn't stopped. I kept my eyes glued to the mirror, searching for some explanation, hoping I'd simply imagined it. But the seat remained empty, an unsettling void in the middle of the bus. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I was too afraid to look over my shoulder, half convinced that if I did, I'd find him standing right behind me. I tried to keep my focus forward, forcing my eyes to stay on the road. But something, an insidious pull, made me check the mirror one last time. And there he was, back in his seat, staring at me with that same unnerving intensity, as though he had never left. His face was expressionless, his eyes dark and endless, like two black voids absorbing everything around them. My breath hitched. I was shaking now, and my mind raced, struggling to find any logical explanation. Had he somehow crouched down, hiding out of sight? Or maybe there was some kind of trick of the light, a shadow cast by the passing street lamps? But deep down, I knew there was no simple answer. I could feel my pulse thundering in my chest as I looked away, my heart pounding as the weight of his gaze bore into me once more. This wasn't normal. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. And the worst part was that we still had miles to go. I didn't see him again for a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling he'd be back. Every night shift, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting him to appear out of nowhere. I even adjusted my route times, swapping with another driver to work an earlier shift. I told myself it was for practical reasons, just a change of pace. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding something. Then, 3 nights later, just as I was starting to believe it had all been a one-time event, he appeared again. I had barely pulled up to the stop when I saw him already standing there, waiting, like he knew exactly when and where I'd arrive. He stepped onto the bus without a sound, making his way down the aisle with that same silent tread. And, as before, he settled into the middle seat, hands folded, eyes fixed on me through the rearview mirror. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I had to confront him, if only to confirm that he was just a man, a strange man, maybe, but a real one. I let the bus idle at the stop longer than necessary, hoping he'd make a sound, shift, acknowledge me. But he did nothing, simply stared, unblinking, his pale face catching the dim light, his scar casting a thin, haunting shadow along his cheek. "Hey, buddy," I called out, forcing my voice to sound casual, though it trembled slightly. "You need anything? Lost or something?" No response. He sat there, unmoving, his dark eyes drilling into me with an intensity that felt unnatural. I waited, feeling my frustration and fear growing in equal measure. "Look," I tried again, more firmly this time, "if you need help, just say so. Otherwise, you're making people uncomfortable." But as I turned back to look at him directly, he wasn't in the middle seat anymore. My breath caught in my throat. Somehow, without my noticing, he had shifted a few rows back, still facing forward, his eyes just barely visible in the corner of the mirror, staring up from the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I hadn't seen him move, hadn't heard a single sound, but there he was, a few seats farther back, yet just as unsettlingly present. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to look away, telling myself that he was just a bizarre passenger, someone with a strange habit or condition. But no matter how much I rationalized it, the feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. The bus filled up as we went along, a few regulars and a handful of new faces. I watched them in the mirror, looking for any sign that they noticed this man's behavior. But as I watched, it became clear they didn't even seem to see him. No one gave him a second glance, or even a first one. It was as if he simply didn't exist. An older woman sat directly across from him, engrossed in her book, her eyes never lifting. A couple took the seat right in front of him, completely oblivious to his presence. I even caught myself wondering if he was truly there, if perhaps I was the only one who could see him. The unsettling encounters continue over the next week. No matter how I altered my route or changed my shifts, he was always there, waiting. And every time, he'd slip into that middle seat, his eyes finding me in the mirror. My attempts to confront him became futile. He never answered, never moved in any way I could perceive. Yet somehow, he would end up in different seats, always in my line of sight, as though he were tethered to me. On the quieter nights, the bus would fall into a profound silence that weighed on my ears, thick and suffocating. Sometimes I thought I heard a soft shuffling behind me, a whisper of movement in the empty aisles when I knew no one else was there. Once, when I stopped at a red light, I swore I heard footsteps approaching from the back of the bus. My skin prickled as the footsteps drew closer, only to stop abruptly as I gripped the steering wheel and held my breath. I checked the mirror. He hadn't moved. Every night, it became harder to convince myself I was imagining things. The way he watched me, unblinking, was no longer just unsettling, it felt like a threat, an intrusion, something crawling under my skin. I'd catch myself clutching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, afraid to look directly for fear of what I might see. More than once, I thought about calling it into my supervisor, or even the police, but each time, I stopped myself. How could I explain this to anyone without sounding insane? Then came the night when everything unraveled. I had almost made it to the last stop of the route, and only a couple of passengers remained on board. I kept glancing in the mirror, watching the stranger, who, as always, held me in that unrelenting stare. The few remaining passengers disembarked, one by one, until it was just him and me left on the bus. I waited, half hoping he'd rise and leave too. But he didn't move. I felt a surge of anger, fueled by days of mounting dread. This was my chance to confront him without an audience. I was done letting him unnerve me. I pulled the bus over to the curb and turned to face him. "All right," I said, louder than intended, my voice sharp in the empty bus. "I don't know who you are or what your game is, but this needs to stop." No response. Just the same, hollow stare. I stepped out of my seat and walked down the aisle, feeling a strange mix of anger and fear twisting in my stomach. But as I approached his row, he was gone. The seat was empty, the air cold, as though he'd never been there at all. I stood there, stunned, glancing around the bus. Had he somehow slipped past me? I scanned the windows, the aisles, every corner, but there was no trace of him. I almost laughed, maybe he'd finally disappeared for good. But then, as I turned back toward the front of the bus, I noticed something strange. Wedged between two seats was a small, yellowed scrap of paper. My pulse quickened as I reached down to pick it up, my hand shaking as I held it to the dim light. It was a bus ticket. Old, worn, the ink barely legible. The date was from over 40 years ago. The blood drained from my face as I read the destination printed on it, this very route. And in the same seat where he had always sat, I found another item, a silver ring, tarnished and scratched with age, as though it had been abandoned for decades. I stared at the items in my hands, the reality of it sinking in with a cold, creeping horror. My mind raced, trying to fit together the pieces. The passenger, he'd been riding my bus long before I ever noticed him. Maybe even before I'd ever driven this route. And as I looked back down the aisle, I realized with chilling clarity that he would never stop coming back. After that night, the stranger's presence went from disturbing to all-consuming. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing him, his pale face, his unwavering eyes, that faint scar along his cheek. I'd dream of him sitting silently in the middle seat, watching me with an intensity that seemed to burn right through my skull. Each time, I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, only to find myself still feeling his eyes on me, as if he were lurking in the shadows of my room. Sleep became a luxury, my nerves frayed, and the endless hours behind the wheel turned into a nightmare of paranoia. Even off the clock, I'd find myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced he'd be standing there on the street corner or reflected in a storefront window. My life unraveled, slipping from routine into a waking horror. Every time I drove past an empty bus stop, I half expected to see him standing there, waiting, his eyes already locked on mine. One night, I stumbled back home after a particularly grueling shift. Exhaustion pulled at me, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. I was haunted, plagued by an incessant need to know what he was and why he wouldn't leave me alone. I began to dig, pulling up old archives and newspaper clippings, combing through anything related to my route, desperate for a clue, something to explain this nightmare. And then, in an old newspaper archive, I found a story from nearly 40 years ago. It was a tragic accident, a bus crash on my very route. The article's grainy photo showed the mangled wreckage of an old city bus at the bottom of a steep ravine. The story said it had been a mechanical failure that sent the bus off course, plunging it down the embankment late one rainy night. Most of the passengers had been trapped inside, and only a few survived the fire that engulfed the bus moments after impact. Among the victims was an unidentified man, no family, no identification, just a lone ticket in his pocket, burned beyond recognition. A chill ran down my spine as I reread the article, my heart hammering. I could practically hear the phantom echo of his footsteps, smell the faint scent of burnt metal and oil. Was that ***? Was he one of the nameless passengers who had died that night, forever bound to his final ride? The realization hit me hard. Maybe he was more than a ghost. Maybe he was a remnant of that final, endless journey, doomed to ride the route again and again. Or maybe he was looking for someone to recognize him, to make sense of his endless waiting. I shuddered, feeling the weight of his eyes in my mind, as though he knew I'd finally discovered his story. Determined to end this torment, I returned to my bus that night with a strange resolve. I didn't know what I planned to do, but I knew this had to stop. I was losing my grip on reality, each day slipping further from any sense of normalcy. Tonight, I would confront him. End this, one way or another. As I started the route, I scanned every stop, watching the street, searching for his pale figure in the shadows. And sure enough, as I pulled up to an empty stop near the edge of town, there he was. He stepped on board without a word, his movements as silent and unnatural as ever. He took his seat in the middle row, hands folded, his eyes locking onto me in the rearview mirror. "Who are you?" My voice cracked as I spoke, the words coming out barely above a whisper. I could feel my hands trembling on the wheel. "What do you want?" No answer. Only his eyes, dark and hollow, staring right through me. I felt a flash of anger, frustration born from weeks of fear and exhaustion. I know about the accident. I know what happened. My voice grew louder, more desperate. "Why are you here? Why won't you leave me alone?" Still, he said nothing, his face a mask of indifference. I looked away, swallowing hard, struggling to keep my focus on the road, to ignore the crawling dread that filled the bus. But in the silence, something began to change. A strange, oppressive cold settled over the bus, filling the air with a dense, chilling fog that I could almost feel in my lungs. And then, faintly, I heard it, the faint echo of whispers, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of earshot. The bus creaked and groaned as though under an immense weight, the lights flickering dimly. I risked a glance in the mirror, and my stomach turned. He was no longer alone. The seats around him, once empty, now out faint outlines, shadowy figures seated side by side, all staring forward with blank, lifeless eyes. The entire bus seemed to be filled with passengers, their faces half-formed, twisted in expressions of terror and resignation. And each one of them had eyes locked on me. My heart pounded in my chest as the whispers grew louder, filling my head with incoherent words, fragments of sentences, pleas, and accusations. I could barely make sense of them, the voices overlapping, blending together in a maddening cacophony. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, as if driven by some unseen force, the bus began to speed up. I tried to press the brakes, but they were unresponsive, the pedals sinking uselessly to the floor. The bus roared forward, faster and faster, as though pulled by an unseen hand. Panic surged through me as I struggled to keep control, the world outside becoming a blur. In the mirror, I could see him, the stranger, no longer a mere passenger, but a commanding presence, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, his pale face twisted in something almost like a smile. The voices intensified, a relentless chorus of despair and anger, and in that moment, I understood. He didn't want help. He didn't want closure. He wanted company. The speedometer climbed higher as we hurtled down the empty street, the bus rattling violently, each bump and jolt pushing me closer to the edge. My heart raced as I fought to keep control, but deep down, I knew I was powerless. This wasn't my bus anymore. It was his. In a final, desperate act, I tore my gaze from the mirror and focused on the road, gripping the wheel with every ounce of strength I had. But as I glanced forward, I saw it, the steep, familiar curve of the road near the old ravine. My mind flashed to the newspaper article, the image of the bus lying in twisted wreckage at the bottom. "No," I whispered, the horror settling in my chest like a stone. I wrenched the wheel, trying to turn, to slow down, but the bus wouldn't respond, as though it had a mind of its own, carrying us toward an inevitable fate. Just as we approached the edge, the world seemed to slow. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, his silent, unyielding stare burrowing into my soul. And then, just as the bus began to tip, teetering on the edge, I looked up one last time into the rearview mirror. There, in the reflection, I saw myself, not as I was, but as he saw me, hollow-eyed and pale, my face twisted in terror, a silent passenger bound to his eternal route. The bus tipped forward, and I felt the ground drop from beneath us. A deafening silence filled the air, the world spinning in a sickening blur. For a brief, suspended moment, everything was still. And then, with a shattering crash, the world went dark. The next morning, when the early shift driver arrived, he found the bus parked neatly at the end of the route, engine cold, doors locked. There was no sign of me, no trace of what had happened during the night. But when he stepped inside, he felt a chill in the air, an inexplicable weight that settled over him like a shadow. And in the middle seat, tucked into the crease of the upholstery, lay a single, faded bus ticket, burned around the edges, with a date from over 40 years ago. No one ever saw me again, though some of the drivers say they still feel someone watching them through the rearview mirror on the late-night route. A faint figure, seated alone in the middle row, waiting to catch their eye. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically as I settled into my chair at the front desk, the faint buzz underscoring the profound stillness of the large building. As a security guard, my nights were often quiet, perhaps too quiet. I'd grown accustomed to the shadows that danced across the walls, the way they seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light, giving life to my imagination. But something about this place felt different. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling tension that wrapped around me like a cold shroud. It had started a week ago, the sound of footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridors. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of my mind, perhaps the result of too many late nights spent staring into the abyss of a dimly lit hallway. I'd convinced myself it was just the building settling, the creaks and groans of an aging structure. But each night, the footsteps grew more pronounced, as if they were deliberately taunting me. They echoed with a rhythm that felt too deliberate, too purposeful. I would rise from my chair, the faint sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears, and venture down the corridor only to find nothing. The silence that met me felt almost mocking. The third night was when I first heard the murmurs. They were soft, barely audible at first, like the whispering of distant voices. I strained to catch the words, but they faded as quickly as they came. It sent a shiver down my spine. I paused in the middle of the hallway, the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a physical force. I called out, my voice swallowed by the shadows. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But there was no response, just the silence that returned, thick and oppressive. I returned to my post, each step feeling heavier than the last. The voices became a regular occurrence, whispering snippets of indistinct conversation that swirled around me. It felt as if they were circling, inching closer every night, their murmurs growing in intensity. I tried to shake the feeling off. After all, I was just a night guard in a building filled with memories, a structure once alive with people now reduced to a shell of its former self. Yet, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that began to fester within me. I found myself checking my watch far too often, the minutes stretching into hours as I paced the hallways, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a knife. With every passing night, the whispers became clearer, more pronounced. They seemed to echo just behind me, only to retreat as I turned around. It was maddening. On the fifth night, as I settled into my routine, a cold chill swept through the building, a stark contrast to the heat of my anxiety. I was at the far end of the corridor, where the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The footsteps were louder this time, a slow, deliberate tread that made my heart race. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the beam flickering slightly as I took a hesitant step forward. Then, amidst the echoing footfalls, came a voice, soft, almost sweet, yet laden with something darker. "Help me," it felt like a plea, resonating deep within me, urging me to respond. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with an instinctual warning. I called out again, "Who's there?" My voice wavered, breaking the fragile silence that had enveloped me. No answer came, only the lingering echo of my own voice. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. "This isn't funny," I added, my bravado faltering. As I turned to head back to the front desk, the whispering grew louder, coalescing into a cacophony of sound that engulfed me. Come back," it echoed around me, twisting my insides into knots. Panic surged within me, igniting a primal fight-or-flight response that screamed for me to run. But I forced myself to remain still, to breathe through the fear that clawed at my throat. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, clear and distinct, calling my name. "David." My heart dropped. No one knew my name here. The realization washed over me like ice water, freezing my veins. I swallowed hard, rationalizing it away, convincing myself it was a figment of my imagination. The isolation, the dark, of course, my mind was playing tricks on me. I was just tired, that's all. Yet, as I made my way back to the front desk, the shadows felt more pronounced, the silence more threatening. The whispers had faded again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the dark, just beyond my vision. I sat back down, forcing myself to focus on the security monitors, but the unsettling feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I was losing my grip on reality, and the thought terrified me. But I had to stay vigilant. After all, that's what I was paid to do. As the clock ticked forward, I clung to the notion that it was all in my head, that there was nothing in the shadows that I couldn't confront. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more sinister than I could comprehend. I leaned back in my chair, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder, the cold whisper of dread curling around my heart. What awaited me in the darkness? As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The following nights passed in a haze of unease, each moment stretching into eternity. I had managed to convince myself that the whispers and footsteps were figments of my imagination, a product of sleep deprivation and the oppressive solitude of my night shifts. Yet, as the days turned into a blur of restless nights, the haunting occurrences began to escalate, pushing me deeper into a spiraling dread. On my 6th night, I was conducting my usual patrol when I noticed the first anomaly that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. I had locked the door to the maintenance room just an hour before, ensuring it clicked shut, but as I approached, I found it standing ajar, the dim light inside spilling out into the corridor like an unwelcome invitation. My heart raced as I glanced around, half expecting to find someone hiding within the shadows, but there was nothing. Just silence. I cautiously pushed the door open wider, peering inside. The room was empty, filled only with dusty tools and old, forgotten equipment. I stepped in, my pulse quickening, the air stale and thick as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I shut the door behind me, locking it again, though a feeling of impending dread weighed on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Just a malfunction, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. Buildings settle, things shift. But my attempts at rationalization faltered as the night wore on. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following my every move. It was a sensation that prickled at my skin, leaving me hyper-aware of the shadows that seemed to deepen and swirl around me. The dim light of the flickering fluorescence only exacerbated my sense of paranoia, casting grotesque shapes along the walls. Then came the laughter. It was soft at first, like the distant echoes of children playing, but it was a sound that felt wholly out of place in the stark, cold emptiness of the building. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as I strained to pinpoint the source. It danced through the air, fading in and out like an old radio tuning in and out of frequency. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice a feeble attempt to break the oppressive silence. I listened intently, heart pounding, but the laughter receded, dissolving into silence once more, leaving me alone with my growing dread. That night, I found myself checking the locks more frequently, making my rounds with a sense of urgency that I couldn't shake. But with each turn of the key and each shadow I passed, the sense of dread intensified. I began hearing cries, low and mournful, echoing through the hallways. The sound twisted through my gut, a primal instinct urging me to flee, but I fought against it, convinced it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks. Yet, my conviction waned further when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. While walking down a less frequented corridor, I noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, faintly glowing in the dim light of my flashlight. They looked almost like runes, intricate and arcane, swirling in patterns that sent a shiver of recognition through me, though I couldn't say why. I was certain these markings weren't there before. A sense of foreboding settled over me like a thick fog, and I found myself stepping back, my breath quickening. What the hell is going on? I muttered, a tremor in my voice as I traced my fingers over the strange carvings. I fought against the rising tide of fear, pushing the thought away that perhaps I had stumbled upon something ancient and sinister, something that should have remained hidden. With each passing hour, the atmosphere in the building thickened, charged with an energy I could not comprehend. The lights flickered more frequently, bathing me in eerie, strobe-like flashes that made the shadows twist and elongate in grotesque forms. I was becoming unmoored, drifting further away from the rational explanations I clung to. Every sound felt amplified, echoing in the hollow spaces around me. As I made my rounds, I swore I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, just fleeting shadows darting away whenever I turned my head. And yet, each time I followed, there was nothing. Just the silence enveloping me, heavy and claustrophobic. On the 8th night, I found myself at the front desk, fingers trembling as I attempted to fill out my nightly reports. I glanced up at the monitor displaying the hallways, the flickering images blurring together like fragmented memories. The unease was palpable, coiling around me, constricting my thoughts. Then came the sound, the unmistakable echo of footsteps once again, this time directly outside the front entrance. My heart raced, and I shot to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. I approached the entrance cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the darkened glass. I squinted into the gloom but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped, leaving behind a deafening silence. Just as I turned back, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoed down the corridor once more, bright and cruel. It sliced through the silence, and I felt my skin crawl. The laughter morphed into cries, high-pitched, desperate, filling the air with a palpable dread. I ran toward the sound, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a compulsion I couldn't understand. But as I reached the hallway, the sound faded into a ghostly silence. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, willing the chill to dissipate. I was losing my grip on reality, and it terrified me. Suddenly, amidst the silence, came a whisper so clear it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. "David." I froze in place, the voice wrapping around me like a vice. It was undeniably real, a cold finger tracing my spine. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me, suffocating in its intensity. I was no longer in control, a primal instinct took over, urging me to flee. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as I stood paralyzed by terror. "David," the voice called again, sweet and sinister, pulling me closer to the edge of the abyss. I felt it beckoning me, luring me into the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet remained glued to the floor, an unseen force holding me captive in that nightmarish moment. What awaited me in the depths of that darkness? I had ventured too far into this nightmare, and now I was lost, teetering on the brink of an unfathomable horror. The chill in the air intensified as I sprinted down the corridor, my breath quick and panicked. I needed to leave this place, needed to escape whatever malevolence lurked within its walls. Each step felt like a descent into a deeper hell, the darkness clawing at my back. I rushed toward the nearest exit, the flickering lights casting grotesque shadows that danced like taunting figures in my peripheral vision. I reached the heavy metal door at the end of the hallway, my hands trembling as I pulled on the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I rattled the doorknob, fear igniting my pulse. "Let me out!" I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. I could feel the whispers now, no longer distant but a cacophony of voices, each overlapping the next, urging me to stop, to turn back, to join them in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, praying that it would work in this cursed place. I glanced at the screen, no signal, just a dead zone of despair. I cursed under my breath, my thoughts spiraling into a frenzy as I turned to another exit, only to find it locked too. The building felt alive, its very structure conspiring against me, trapping me within its cold, dark embrace. The laughter returned, a sinister melody that echoed through the empty halls. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, but the sensation of being watched bore down on me, suffocating and relentless. The whispers morphed into a guttural chant, filling my mind with dread. I felt the cold brush of invisible hands against my skin, probing and reaching for me, igniting a primal fear I hadn't known existed. In the back of my mind, memories flickered like dying embers, fragments of stories I had pushed away, long buried in the recesses of my mind. This building, I remembered, had a dark history. It had once been a refuge for the lost and desperate, a place filled with sorrow and despair. People had vanished within these walls, their fates intertwined with the shadows that haunted them. The stories whispered of lingering spirits, souls unable to find peace. Suddenly, a memory burst forth, vivid and painful, a glimpse of a childhood friend lost to darkness, a tragedy that had forever marked me. I had buried it deep, convinced I had moved on, but the building seemed to know. It pulled at the threads of my past, unraveling secrets I thought I had hidden. "David," the voice called again, softer now, yet laden with a knowing that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and the air grew thick with an otherworldly presence that surrounded me. I could feel it, the pressure of something unseen, an entity that clung to my very soul, dragging me deeper into its nightmarish grasp. Desperation clawed at my throat as I turned away from the door and fled down another corridor. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, morphing into a sinister chant that echoed through the shadows. "David, come back, join us." I reached a large atrium, the ceiling stretching high above me, the moonlight spilling in through broken windows, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like forgotten memories. My pulse raced, and I turned to look behind me, expecting to see nothing, yet the oppressive darkness felt alive, thrumming with energy. Then, before me, it materialized, a figure wreathed in shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. It stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat as the apparition began to take shape. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil of darkness, but her presence was undeniable. I felt an inexplicable connection, a sense that she held the key to everything I had buried. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper, trembling as I took a cautious step back. Her voice echoed through the space, resonating in a way that sent chills coursing through my veins. "I am the keeper of secrets, David. You thought you could escape the past, but it has always been with you, just as I have." As she stepped closer, the shadows coalesced around her, revealing eyes that pierced through the darkness. I gasped, recognizing the shape of her face, one I had known in life, one I had lost long ago. "Megan," I whispered, my heart breaking at the realization. It was my childhood friend, the one I had lost in a tragic accident years ago. The memories flooded back, guilt, despair, the weight of my own helplessness. "Megan, I'm so sorry," I choked out, tears blurring my vision. "I never meant for it to happen." Her expression softened, but the shadows that enveloped her pulsed with a dark energy. "You didn't save me, David. You left me behind. You've carried that guilt ever since." Working the night shift at Bridgemont General Hospital wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills. My friends said I was brave for taking it on, given the eerie quiet that blankets the hospital at night, but I didn't see myself that way. To me, It was just part of the routine. The soft hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional beep from heart monitors, and the shuffling footsteps of a nurse on the late rounds were the soundtrack of my life. It was nearing 2 a.m., and I was making my usual rounds in the children's ward. Only one limb was occupied tonight, a small boy recovering from surgery. It was so quiet that every creak in the building seemed amplified, echoing through the empty halls. I was checking on a supply cart when I noticed a small figure at the end of the corridor, barely visible under the dim lights. A child. At first, I assumed it was the boy from the room, but that wouldn't make sense. I had just checked on him, and he was fast asleep, heavily sedated for the pain. I squinted into the shadows, thinking maybe my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But as I stepped closer, I saw him more clearly. He looked like he was maybe 8 or 9, standing there in the hall, barefoot, wearing a pair of faded, loose-fitting pajamas. His hair was dark, slightly messy, and he had this wide-eyed, anxious look, his gaze darting around as though he was afraid of something. "Hey," I called out gently, not wanting to scare him. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. He just looked at me, then quickly darted down the hall, slipping around a corner. I sighed, already feeling the familiar sense of dread that always accompanied an unusual sighting. Wandering children were common in this hospital. Kids would sometimes wake up confused after surgery or scared by a bad dream, so they'd wander out of their rooms, seeking comfort. But something about this child felt wrong. Maybe it was his clothes. They looked like something out of an old photograph, the kind of worn, generic pajamas you don't see much these days, like they belonged to a different era. I shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to my exhaustion. Just another night, I told myself as I moved down the hall, determined to find him before he got hurt. As I approached the corner, though, he was gone. I checked the rooms, the stairwell, even the bathrooms, but he seemed to have vanished. After a few minutes of searching, I gave up, thinking he might have gone back to his room, wherever that was. Maybe he was from another ward entirely, and one of the nurses there would find him soon enough. But as the night went on, he kept appearing. A glimpse of him down another hallway, his small face peeking out from behind a doorframe, watching me with that same, hauntingly scared expression. Each time I saw him, I would try to approach, and each time, he would slip away as if he were made of smoke. I told one of my coworkers about him, a seasoned nurse named Janet who had been with the hospital for over 20 years. "A kid wandering around in those old clothes," she repeated with a laugh, brushing it off as fatigue. "Sounds like you need a nap, Clara. Kids don't wear stuff like that anymore. And no one's on the roster who fits that description." "But I've seen him 3 times now," I insisted, my voice almost pleading. Janet just patted me on the shoulder. "You work too hard, hon. I'll bet a good night's sleep will get rid of that little ghost of yours." "Ghost?" I whispered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop myself. I hadn't thought of him that way, not really. I was a logical person, and I never believed in ghosts or spirits. Still, as I continued my rounds, the idea took root in my mind, growing with every sighting. The hours dragged on, and the hospital grew colder and quieter as the night wore on. I continued to catch glimpses of him, each sighting bringing him closer. Once, I saw him crouched in the corner of a hallway, hugging his knees, looking more vulnerable than ever. My heart clenched. He looked like he needed help, maybe even comfort. No matter how unsettling his appearance, he was still a child, lost and alone in this maze of hallways. I knelt down, holding my hands up to show I meant no harm. "It's okay. I'm here to help you," I whispered, my voice soft. Can you tell me your name?" For the first time, he seemed to hesitate, his face shifting from fear to something else, something almost familiar. But then, just as I thought he might speak, he was gone again, like a flicker in my vision. I could swear I hadn't blinked, hadn't moved, but he just vanished as if he'd been an illusion. I felt a chill run through me, a feeling I couldn't shake. There was something off about this, something beyond my understanding. My hands shook as I continued my rounds, and my stomach tightened each time I passed a hallway or turned a corner, half expecting him to be there, waiting for me. I even checked the security monitors at one point, but there was no sign of him, no small figure in the halls. Finally, as my shift neared its end, I couldn't let it go. I headed to the records room, hoping that I might find something, anything, to help me make sense of this. I searched through old files and patient logs, scanning for any record of a child who might match his description. It was a long shot, but I had to try. My gut told me this child had a history here, something that the rest of the staff either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore. After what felt like hours of combing through paperwork, I stumbled upon an old, yellowing file. The cover was labeled Missing Persons Case Number 297, and the photograph clipped to it showed a young boy who looked eerily familiar. The hair, the wide eyes, the pajamas. My breath hitched as I realized it was him, the child I'd been seeing all night. According to the report, he had been a patient here nearly 30 years ago. A boy named David, who had been admitted for a minor procedure, only to disappear from his room one night without a trace. The file indicated that the hospital had conducted a massive search at the time, even involving the police, but they never found him. The report ended with a single, chilling sentence, "Case unresolved, presumed runaway." As I read those words, a chill crept up my spine. I suddenly felt as though I were being watched, and when I looked up, I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass door. David's small figure, standing just behind me. I whirled around, but he was gone. The discovery of David's file weighed heavily on my mind as I left the records room, my heart racing with a mix of dread and determination. I had to find a way to help him, to bring closure to a story that had been left unfinished for far too long. I felt a growing sense of responsibility for this lost child, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next night, I threw myself into research, determined to find any remaining records of David's disappearance. I combed through old newspapers, medical journals, and archived patient records, but each search yielded little more than what I had already found. Yet, the deeper I dug, the more I could feel the air around me shifting. As I sat in the hospital library, poring over faded articles about David, I suddenly felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, despite the windows being tightly shut. I glanced up, instinctively looking around, but the space was empty. Still, I felt a presence, as though someone was standing just out of view. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the articles. But then strange occurrences began to escalate. Doors creaked open by themselves, flickering lights cast long shadows across the floor, and the feeling of being watched grew more intense each night. I could no longer dismiss these happenings as mere fatigue or tricks of the mind. It felt like the hospital itself was alive, holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. One night, while checking in on the few patients scattered throughout the pediatric ward, I encountered a girl who was barely 10 years old, recovering from surgery. As I adjusted her forward drip, she suddenly looked past me, her expression shifting from pain to confusion. "There's a boy in the corner," she whispered, her voice trembling. He's playing with the toys." My heart raced. "What do you mean? What does he look like?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She hesitated, her brows furrowing as though she was trying to recall a dream. I don't know. He just disappears when I try to look at him. Does he look scared? I pressed, hoping to gain some insight into David's fate. The girl shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion. He looks happy, like he wants to play. But he always goes away. I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. You're sure you see him? I asked, even though my gut told me she was being honest. You're not just imagining it? She shrugged, her small shoulders drooping. I don't know. I just know he's there. As I moved on to the next room, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was him again, David. This time, he was standing at the end of the hallway, looking back at me with an expression that was both inviting and melancholic. I took a deep breath, summoning all the courage I could muster, and rushed towards him. David! Wait! I called, but he simply smiled and turned, darting around a corner. I raced after him, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare, but I had to reach him. Each time I almost caught up, he slipped away, weaving through shadows and into the depths of the hospital. The sightings became more frequent, yet he seemed to elude me each time, his form flickering in and out of existence. I began waking up in strange places, once in the hospital's storage room, another time in the break room, with no memory of how I had gotten there. Each time, I awoke with a new piece of knowledge about David's story, details I was sure I had never encountered before. I found myself knowing the layout of the hospital in ways that felt almost instinctual, as if I had walked its halls in another life. It wasn't until one evening, after a particularly vivid dream where David had shown me fragments of his past, that I stumbled upon a hidden door at the end of the east wing. The door was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, and the wood was warped as if it hadn't been opened in decades. I felt an inexplicable pull towards it, an urge I couldn't ignore. As I pushed against the door, it creaked open with a low groan, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. My heart raced, fear twisted in my stomach, but curiosity and a deep sense of urgency compelled me to descend. The air was thick and stale, and each step echoed in the silence. The deeper I went, the colder it became, a chill creeping into my bones. Suddenly, I heard whispers, soft, pleading voices, echoing around me. "Help us," they seemed to say, rising from the darkness. Panic set in, but I pressed on, feeling David's presence guiding me. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in a long-forgotten basement room. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and strange symbols were etched into the floor. In the center of the room lay a dusty old doll, its glass eyes staring blankly into space. My heart sank as I recognized the doll from the old photographs of David. Just then, a chill swept through the room, and I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter, childish, echoing, taunting. I turned, only to find David standing there, his small form shrouded in shadow. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice tinged with fear and urgency. Before I could respond, the whispers intensified, swirling around me, and the shadows lengthened, closing in. David looked terrified now, glancing over his shoulder as if he could sense something approaching, something sinister. "Run!" he screamed, and before I could react, the room shifted. The walls trembled, and the laughter grew louder, more sinister, as I felt myself being pulled back towards the stairs. I stumbled, desperately trying to reach him, but as I reached for his hand, he vanished, leaving me standing alone in the dark. The days that followed my discovery in the basement were a blur of haunting visions and sleepless nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone, that something unseen and deeply sinister watched my every move. Even in the hospital's bright, bustling daytime hours, I felt the weight of shadowy figures lingering just out of sight, as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe. Determined to free David from whatever held him here, I redoubled my efforts to uncover the hospital's forgotten history. Nights were spent poring over archives, reviewing handwritten records that the hospital had long since abandoned. I found obscure notes about accidents that had taken place during renovations decades ago, cryptic references to incidents that no one had dared to document in full. Yet the truth came in fractured, eerie pieces. I started piecing together the events leading to David's death. He hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been taken. His life ended in some ritual I could barely comprehend. The hospital, in its earliest days, had been privately owned by a man named Dr. Enoch Crowley, an eccentric physician known for his unorthodox methods. Rumors circulated that Crowley had delved into strange, occult practices, believing that by performing certain rites, he could cure patients of their ailments, or so he claimed. David, from what I could gather, had been one of the doctor's unfortunate patients. The boy had arrived with nothing more serious than a routine illness, yet Crowley had taken an unusual interest in him. The last records of David's stay described a peculiar ritual Crowley had conducted, a purification rite meant to remove the ailments of the flesh and spirit. The words left me shivering, a hollow dread filling me as I began to understand why David remained trapped in these halls. The nurse's station became my refuge as I tried to make sense of everything. One night, as I sat alone, the lights above me began to flicker, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. I felt a sudden coldness, and then a voice, soft, pleading, whispered my name. I spun around, heart racing, and saw David standing there, his small figure trembling. His face, once so blank and distant, now looked pained, desperate. "You have to help me," he whispered, his voice carrying an urgency that chilled me to my core. "I don't want to be here anymore." I took a cautious step forward, but before I could respond, the lights went out completely, plunging the hall into darkness. And then, from the shadows, I saw them, shadowy figures moving toward me, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Adults, draped in old-fashioned clothing, their faces obscured in darkness. I could feel the cold malice radiating from them, a warning that I was venturing into dangerous territory. They were connected to David, bound to this place as tightly as he was, yet they had no desire to leave. In their silence, I understood they were here to ensure that David remained. The figures moved closer, surrounding me, their expressions hidden but their intentions clear. Suddenly, I felt myself being pulled, my vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in. And then I saw it, flashes of an old operating room, a young David lying on a cold table, with shadowy figures looming above him, chanting words I couldn't understand. My stomach turned as I realized I was witnessing the night of the ritual, the moment he'd been lost to this place forever. The vision faded, leaving me gasping for air, alone in the hallway. But the figures remained, their gaze heavy, accusatory. They didn't speak, but their message was clear: leave the past buried. I staggered back, clutching the wall for support, but I knew I couldn't abandon David. I had to find a way to break the hold they had on him, to free him from this cursed place. Driven by desperation, I returned to the basement, where David's presence had first revealed itself. The doll I'd seen earlier still lay on the floor, gathering dust, but this time it seemed to radiate a strange energy, as though it were key to the spell binding him here. As I knelt to pick it up, I felt a searing pain in my chest, and suddenly the room spun, images flashing before my eyes. I was back in David's world, a world where he was trapped, reliving his final moments over and over. His fear, his pain, it all washed over me, and I could feel the unbearable weight of it, the hopelessness of being unable to leave. Through the haze of fear and pain, David's small voice broke through. "Please," he whispered, "you have to let me go. Help me, leave." Holding the doll close, I spoke words I hadn't realized I knew, words that felt ancient and powerful, as though they'd been carved into the very bones of this place. "David Crowley, by the light of the living and the peace of the dead, I release you. I break the ties that bind you here." In that moment, the room erupted with a cold gust of wind, the shadows swirling as though caught in a storm. The whispering voices grew louder, desperate and angry, but David's figure grew brighter, his form becoming more solid, more real. He looked at me, his expression one of profound relief, and he mouthed a silent thank you as he began to fade, the light around him growing blinding. But then, as he disappeared, I felt something change within me, a shift, a sensation as though a weight had settled into my chest, cold and heavy. The shadows began to thin, the basement returning to its dusty silence. But as I took a step forward, I realized that I couldn't leave. I tried to climb the stairs, to push open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, and a voice whispered in my mind, one that sounded oddly like David's, "Thank you. But someone must remain." Panic gripped me as the realization dawned. I had taken his place. By freeing him, I had unknowingly accepted the hospital's curse, binding myself to it just as he had been. The hospital had demanded a life, a soul to inhabit its shadows, and in my desperation to help, I had offered my own. I screamed, pounding on the door, but no one answered. The hospital was silent once more, and I knew then that I was as much a part of it as the faded wallpaper and the creaking floors. My life had been exchanged, sacrificed to the darkness that resided within these walls. And now, I was trapped, watching the world above as a shadow, unseen but ever present, waiting for someone to notice, to remember, to set me free. But as I lingered in the cold silence, a new fear crept into my heart, a fear that perhaps, even if someone did find me, I would do to them what the hospital had done to David. A fear that, like the shadows before me, I would stop at nothing to keep them from leaving. And so, I wait.